Okay, I just wanted to continue a little bit with some halachic aspects. Before we leave Trumas and Maasros, just a few points here. Again, the Torah requires that the following things be done when you have produce in Eretz Yisrael. Every year of the Shemitah cycle, you take off Truma, which D'oraisa can be anything, but Midrabanan will typically be 2%. And then you take 10% of what remains and give it to the Levi. That's called Meiser Rishon. And then we discuss the Knas of Ezra, that you give it to a Kohen. Does that mean also to a Kohen in lieu of a Levi, or only to a Kohen? And does it apply today? That's machlokas about the Knas of Ezra. And then there's a second Meiser on the base that remains, which on year 1, 2, 4, and 5 is Maser Sheni, that is taken to Yerushalayim and eaten. And if it's too far, you can redeem it on money, and you take the money to Yerushalayim and you buy food. And year 3 and 6 is Meiser Ani, 10% that's given to the poor, and they could eat it anywhere. They don't have to eat it in Yerushalayim. So, B'sach HaKol, what percentage are you kind of separating? So you're actually separating approximately, it's a little less because of the 22% of your produce. Although when it's Meiser Sheni, that 10% you eat, so it's not really a loss, but it's up to 22% of your produce. It's a little less because of the different base of the 10%. And the Levi, in turn, must take off 10% of the Maser Rishon and give it to the Kohen as Trumas Meiser. Now again, let me point out the difference between Trumas Meiser and Truma Gedola. Truma Gedola, min HaTorah, can be any amount, even 1 grain. Trumas Meiser has to be 10%. In other words, the din of 10% of Trumas Meiser is not a Drabanan. That's a Torah requirement. Now, until these matanot are separated, all of them, there's an Isser D'Oraisa of Tevel. That's Tes Beis Lamed, an Isser D'Oraisa of Tevel, to eat it. Meaning, even if the Kohen has his own grain, and if he separates Truma, he's going to be able to give himself the Truma. Until he separates the Truma, he cannot eat the grain. There's an Isser of Tevel. Right? So Tevel is a very chomer tekei Isser D'Oraisa. Now, today, I don't want to go over the whole protocol because Baruch Hashem, most people don't have, well, maybe it's not Baruch Hashem, but most people don't take off Trumas and Maasros themselves because you rely on hashgachos, although one should know how to do it. But today, we don't do Nesina. That's the first difference. We don't actually give these to anybody. Now, why don't we give things to... So the truth is, it's not as simple as you might assume. Let's go over each analysis, each chelik. We don't give Truma to a Kohen today because since everybody is becheskas Truma, because we've come in contact with dead bodies, and we don't have the ashes of the Para Aduma to be matarer us, so everybody is called Tameh. A Kohen that's Tameh is not allowed to eat Truma. Therefore, we don't give the Truma, we discard it in plastic. Throw it in the garbage, but you wrap it in plastic. Now, because of that, that actually changes the amount of Truma that we separate today. We do not separate 2% for Truma. We separate a mashahu for Truma. And the reason is very simple. When did the Chachamim require that you give a minimum shear for Truma? When you're going to give it to a Kohen. But when it's going to be thrown away, why should the Chachamim increase the amount that you separate? So, Bizman Hazeh, there are 2 shinuyim in our Hafreshas Truma. Number 1, we don't give it to a Kohen. We throw it away. Number 2, we separate a mashahu rather than the 2%. And those two differences are interrelated precisely because we don't give it to a Kohen. We go back to the Mashu. Now, what's interesting is, though, there is one way that we could do Nesina to a Kohen, even Bizman Hazeh, and that is Truma that's Tameh, because the Truma is also Tameh. The Kohen is Tameh, the Truma is Tameh. Truma that's Tameh can be fed to a Kohen's animal. So, what is sometimes done is, for large farms and the like, in which the Truma is a lot, they actually feed it, they donate it to the zoo, the Jerusalem Zoo, and the zoo has a Kohen, just like a Goy buys chametz or a Goy buys land during Shemitah. So they have a Kohen. A Kohen is the owner of all of the animals in the zoo, and this allows the animals to be fed Truma that is Tameh. So the animal is better than the Kohen. The Kohen would not be allowed to eat the Truma. But the animal of a Kohen is allowed to eat the Truma. Okay. So, once again, though, we don't give the Truma to the Kohen because the Kohen is Tameh. The Kohen is not allowed to eat it. Yeah?
What is a mashu?
Mashu is any amount. Like one. Now, the same thing is true with the Trumas Maser. Now, today, the way it works is, since we don't, well, okay, let me do Maser Rishon first. Now, what about Maser Rishon? When I separate 10% to be Maser Rishon, do I give that to a Levi or a Kohen, depending on Ezra's Kanas? Now here, the case for not giving it is a much weaker case. Because Maser Rishon does not have Kedusha. Maser Rishon is something you have to give a Kohen as like a debt, but it's not Kadosh. And in fact, a Kohen could invite you to eat it with him. In other words, if I give a Kohen Truma, the Truma has Kedusha. It can only be eaten by a Kohen and his family, and he has to be Tor. A Kohen could not invite me to eat a meal of Truma with him. Maser Rishon is a totally different type of situation. Maser Rishon, there's an obligation on me to give it to a Levi, or a Kohen, whatever the Kanas. But it doesn't have Kedusha. And since it doesn't have Kedusha, number one, a Levi could eat it even if he's Tameh. And number two, even Israel could eat it as long as he's doing it with the permission of the Levi. In other words, it's not usher to a zor, unlike Truma. So if all of that is true, why don't we give Maser Rishon to a Levi? We don't. Why don't we give Maser Rishon to a Levi? So here, the answer is not the same as for Truma. For Truma, the answer was because of Tuma. But that's not an answer for Maser Rishon. So here we have a different answer, which actually will be another answer for Truma too. And that is, today, the yichus, the lineage of all Kohanim and Leviim is in doubt. And therefore, anybody who says he's a Kohen, I have the right to say, prove it. And since when it comes to a monetary debt, the big rule in halacha is, hamotzi mechavero olav haraya, meaning if you're trying to collect from me, you got to bring a proof. If you don't bring a proof, I don't have to pay you. So I don't have to give Maser Rishon to a Levi because every Levi might not be a Levi. Therefore, I can eat the Maser Rishon. I don't. The truth is, I don't discard it. I discard the Truma because if the Kohen doesn't get it, I can't eat it. It has Kedusha. Once I don't have to give the Maser Rishon, after I separate it, I actually eat it. So the Maser Rishon is not discarded. It is designated and separated, and then it's eaten based on Hamotzi Mechavera of Haraya, But still, it is brought down that there is a hidur today to try to give the Maser Rishon to a Levi or a Kohen, even though you don't know for sure. But Me'ikar Hadin, you could be Ma'akavit La'atzmai. Now, however, in the Maser Rishon, 10% of that Maser Rishon is Trumas Maser. Now, the Trumas Maser does have Kedusha. Only a Kohen could eat it. Only a Tohar Kohen could eat it. A non-Kohen is not allowed to eat it, even with the permission of the Kohen. Therefore, even though we don't have to discard the Maser Rishon, but the Trumas Maser of the Maser Rishon has to be discarded along with the Mashahu of the Truma Gedola. Because those are Kadosh, and those are forbidden for a non-Kohen. Okay? But the Maser Rishon I keep because of the suffix, Amosi Mechavere Alav Haraya. Now, what about the Maser Sheni? Now, Maser Sheni also has Kedusha. It can only be eaten by a Tohar person, and all of us are Tameh. It can only be eaten in Yerushalayim, which actually would mean the old city, the walled part of Yerushalayim. And according to many opinions, it can only be eaten when there's a Beis HaMikdash. So, if I separate the Maser Sheni, I've created an entity that I'm not allowed to eat, so would I have to discard that? The answer is no. I redeem it on a coin that I save for later use when Mashiach comes. And once I redeem the Maser Sheni, I'm allowed to eat it even if I'm Tameh and even if it's not in Yerushalayim. So I hope you're getting the gist here. The gist here basically is that the Maser Rishon you keep, the Maser Sheni you redeem, the Truma Gedola and the Trumas Maser have to be discarded. I'll get to Maserani in a moment. Now, that actually means that the amount that you're actually discarding from the produce, when I have to take off Trumas and Maser Zman Hazeh, it is slightly more than 1%. Because 1% of the produce is the Trumas Maser, and the slightly more than 1% is the Truma Gedola, which the Oraisa, you could be mafresh with any amount, and since it's not going to go to the Kohen, the Chachamim did not impose the requirement. So we've gone from 22% to only 1% plus a masha. Right? That's very little that's discarded. Now what about Maser Ani? So here, the emes is the following. Maser Ani is not Kaddish. Maser Ani is like tzedakah. I have to give, in year 3 and year 6, I got to give 10% of my crop to the Aniyim. So if I'm a farmer, and I know this is Maser Ani, then I got to give it to poor people. And it's true that maybe a person has to prove that he's poor, but that's not so hard. Hey, you got to prove that you're poor. Okay, Beseder, but often a person can prove that he's poor. It's not the most difficult thing in the world. And yet, most of the time when we separate Trumas and Masros, we don't give the Maser Ani either. Why is that? That doesn't make sense. Maser Ani, it seems, you should have to give for sure. Not discard. Give to the Ani. So the answer is, because here too there's a suffix. Based on mass production and warehousing, we often don't know if a fruit or vegetable belongs to year 2 or year 3. In other words, it's a suffix Maser Sheni, a suffix Maser Ani. And indeed, in the standard nusach of Hafrasha, you actually say, I am hereby designating 10% to be Maser Sheni, if it belongs to a Maser Sheni year, which I am now redeeming on a coin. And if this is year 3 or year 6 produce, I designate it as Maser Ani. So if we consider, because of modern processing, that there is a doubt if it is Ani or Sheni, so once again, that's Hamotzi Mechavera Elav Haraya. You see, that's also, in other words, you're a poor guy and you say, hey, you owe me Maser Sheni. I'm sorry, you owe me Maser Ani. Well, I could say, you got to prove that this is from the 3rd year. Maybe it's from that's all. Maybe it's from the 2nd year. So if I'm a farmer and I know, Ein Achinami, farmers have to give the Maser Ani. But if I'm a consumer who bought, let's say, unsupervised produce, then halachically I don't know if it's a Maser Sheni year or a Maser Ani year. So I got to separate them both. That's what we do. In other words, we basically say, if this is Maser Sheni, I hereby declare it to be Maser Sheni, 10% to be Maser Sheni, which is redeemed on a coin, so I can then keep it and eat it. And if it's year 3, it's Maser Ani, I can also eat it because it's not Kadesh. The only thing is you're stealing from the poor. But on that we answer, if it's a suffix, Hamotzi Mechaveru Elav Haraya allows you to keep it. So it's complicated. So it turns out, I separate the Maser Rishon and I keep it. I separate the Maser Sheni and I redeem it. I separate the Maser Ani in the same Hafresha. I keep it. The only thing I have to discard is the Mashahu, that is Truma Gedola, and the 1%, which is the 10% of the Maser Rishon, that would be Trumas Maser. So in total, the amount that you discard from all of your produce is 1% and a Mashahu. Okay? I hope this makes a little sense. Now, if you are a farmer who knows if it's year 2 or year 3, you actually know, so the farmer would have to give the Maser, if it's a Maser Sheni year, he would redeem the Maser Sheni and keep the coin somewhere. If it's a Maser Ani year, he would actually have to give. He would actually have to give the Maser Ani to an Ani because he knows this is year 3 or year 6. Okay, but I as a consumer don't know that, and therefore I as a consumer declare Maser Sheni, Maser Ani, misafek, and al samotzi mechaver lo faraya, I don't have to give it to an Ani. Now again, it'd be a nice thing if you did, but in terms of halacha, you're not mechayiv to give it. Now the way you separate is you can do it in a million different ways. You can do it apple by apple. You could just literally take off a little piece of apple for 100 apples. Or if you have 100 apples, you can, give an apple or whatever it is. In other words, you can make one apple to be the Trumas and Masros on the whole thing, which is, that's the way a farmer would do it typically. The thing is that you can't do it min al she'eno minai. So let's take Truma. Let's go with 2% Truma, which we don't do today, but just as an example. If you have 50 bushels of apples and 50 bushels of pears. So you have a total of 100 bushels. So your obligation is 2 bushels of truma. But you can't give 2 bushels of pears. You have to give a bushel on the apples and a bushel on the pears. Right? You can't give more from one species to cover another species. Each min has to have its own hafresha. Okay, so this can get a little crazy. If you bought a bag of mixed Israeli vegetables without hashgacha, I don't even know if there's such a thing, but there theoretically could be. So you have in there peas, string beans, corn, carrots, right? So you got to separate on the carrots, on the peas, on the string beans, on the corn. You can't just take a general handful and have it cover, unless your handful has everything in it, which might be likely as well. That's called ein tormin mimin al she'eno mino. Did you want to say something? You had a hand. Yeah.
Do people just have nicer shiny money just waiting around to be redeemed?
Yeah. So again, most people may not have the occasion to ever separate trumas and masros. Because, if you buy fruits and vegetables under a hashgacha, and again, I'm not here to talk about what hashgachas are good, I don't want to get in trouble, but if you buy with a reliable hashgacha, they've taken care of it. They've separated. Right? So I go to Arzibir across the street and I buy an apple. I don't worry about trumas and masras. It was done already. But there are times in which people have to do it themselves. Sometimes they buy from an unsupervised store, or sometimes they're their own gardeners. If you grow your own fruit, if you have a fruit tree or a vegetable patch, you gotta. If I don't do it, who's going to do it? I mean, I got to do it. There's no store that's doing it. So you need a coin upon which you can transfer the holiness of the Maser Sheni, and you keep that coin in a safe place, and that's a holy coin. You don't use it for any spending. It's only used for Maser Sheni, and when the Beis HaMikdash is rebuilt, you will take that coin and you will buy food with it. Now, the coin can get used up after a while, meaning to say, if you use it, because what you're doing is you're using up a pruta every time. A pruta is like, let's say, a penny, whatever it is. So if your coin contains 200 prutos, every time you redeem your Maser Sheni, you're using up a pruta of it. Well, after you've done it 200 times, the coin is filled up. You'll have to have another coin. But yeah, people who separate trumas and masras have a coin. I have a coin in my house that's on the wall, and we have like markings how many times it was used. But as I say, for the most part, if you buy with hashgachos, so you don't have a problem. Although I will tell you, Rabbi Yashiv encouraged people. Yashiv held there was an inyan that every person should take trumas and maasros from everything they get, no matter what the hashgacha. He actually said, even if you buy under the Eda Charedis, the Badatz, that's called the gold standard hashgacha of Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Yashiv held you should separate trumas and maasros. Again, that has not been widely followed, even in the yeshivish world. Most people don't b'dafka go out of their way to do it, but he held yes, of course, without a bracha. When something is tevel mamish, like you grew it, you actually make a bracha when you separate. Obviously, if you buy something under hashgacha, so they probably did take off trumas and masras, and Rabbi Yashiv's chumrah would be to be extra sure, but you wouldn't make a bracha on it. And I don't think the minhag, I don't follow it myself. I don't think Rabbi Yashiv's hanhaga was widely followed. Yeah.
If someone moves outside of Israel and they buy Israeli produce, do they still have to separate from them?
Yeah, so this is a very important issue. The issue of trumas and maasros depends on where the produce is grown. It does not depend on where the produce is eaten. So if I bring in an American fruit and I bring it to Israel, I don't have to take off trumas and maasros, even though I'm eating it here. The other way around, if I take fruit from here that's exported to America or some other country, I have to take off trumas and maasros. Now, this raises a very, very significant problem from people. We have there's quite a lot of relative amount of produce from Israel that are in regular supermarkets. There is the famous Jaffa orange. I think there's less of them now than there used to be, but it used to be very ubiquitous. Everything was Jaffa oranges. But sometimes they don't even, at least Jaffa oranges, at least I know it's from Israel. But there is produce that they don't even say is from Israel. There are a lot of peppers, green and red peppers. For some reason, a lot of regular supermarket chains import them from Israel. And it doesn't even say, or maybe there'd be a tiny little label, product of Israel, sometimes you see. So you do have a problem when you buy Israeli produce. How do you know there was trumas and masros taken off? Because typically the produce doesn't come with the hashgacha. There's no tu'udah. Unlike in Israel itself, I go into a store and there'll be a sign that says, whatever your hashgacha is, I'm not addressing that issue, but it'll say trumas and masros were separated. When I have a bin of green peppers in Giants or Safeway, it doesn't say trumas and masros are separated. So how do I know? So some people say, don't buy Israeli produce, which, that doesn't sound so good. Others say, buy and separate trumas and masros, which is okay. There's a third shita that says, and this is little ambiguous. They claim the Rabbanut itself has a program that no Israeli produce can be exported until Trumas and Masros were taken off. Meaning, even though they allow farmers to sell in Israel without Trumas and Masros, in other words, if I don't want to pay for hashgacha, I'm not going to be stopped. I can sell fruits and vegetables without Trumas and Masros. It's not against the law, but apparently the Rabbanut managed to get a law passed that no produce can be exported unless Trumas and Masros were taken off. I have heard this from a number of people, not in the yeshiva world. I cannot vouch if it's accurate. But that would be very, very interesting. I mean, if this is accurate, and if you rely on Rabbanut, which is another question, but if you rely on the Rabbanut Hashgacha, it would turn out that you don't have a problem with chutz la'aretz, with the imported vegetables from Israel to chutz la'aretz, based on this law that says that they cannot export until they take off Trumas and Masros. Yeah.
Nowadays our foods have like dozens and dozens of ingredients in them. I know, for example, things like salt are not subject to Trumas and Masros. Are there what's the qualification of how significant a food has to be to be needed?
Yeah, well, basically, any amount. In fact, you see, until you take off Trumas and Masros, it's tevel. And tevel is not batal in 60. So even if it's less than 1 part in 60. So chazer would be batal. Tevel is not batal. So it turns out that no matter what the amount is, Trumas and Masros have to be separated. So when you're dealing with a composite processed food, then of course it's much more complicated. Okay, so this is a little bit of the Trumos and Masros issue, and I just wanted to say that the fact that we don't give it, there's not one answer. In other words, every single matana has to be looked at separately as reasons, and the total amount that we discard, because we can't do anything with, is the 1% of the whole that represents the trumas maser, which is 10% of the 10%, and anything a little bit more than the 1%, which represents the truma gedola, because those are the things that have kedusha. They cannot be eaten by people who are tamei, and they cannot be given to a kohen bisman hazeh, and they cannot be eaten by Yisrael, and they can't be redeemed. Therefore, we're stuck, so we have to discard it, or in some cases, it can be given to an animal of a kohen, and the like. Everything else, through various ways, we manage to keep. The only thing is, if the farmer knows that something is maserani, he knows it's from year 3, he would have to give it to the poor. Yeah.
Is there any Indian of Bal Tashkas, especially by the Trumas Mice and Truma Goda, that we should try really hard to give it to animals that can eat it so it's not wasted?
Yeah, well, it would make sense that why not give it to an animal? That would be better than throwing it away. But nevertheless, there's no Bal Tashchis per se, because if you're not allowed to eat it, so you're allowed to throw it away. I mean, listen, animals eat from the garbage too, right? In other words, if I throw things into the garbage, the cats here will be able to eat it. Of course, you might argue, but that's worse, because, hey, wait a second. If the cats eat it, they don't belong to a kohen. So wouldn't it be better for me to give it to a kohen's animal, like the zoo, whatever it would be? It's a good ha'ara, but for some reason the minhag is more people throw it away than give it to an animal.
And is it also for a goy to eat tevel?
Also for what?
For a goy to eat tevel?
The pashtus, there is no isser for a goy to eat tevel, but I would not be allowed to give it to a goy, because by giving him a gift, I'm getting a benefit of being a gift giver, that he appreciates me. And tevel is usher in hana, not just achila. So I can't give him a gift, but if I leave it and I'm mafker it and he takes it, l'chayra, that would be mutter. That would be mutter.
Is that something that people try to do with their thing? They can just leave it out for, I suppose you would never know if a goy was like it.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm gonna have to think about it, because the problem basically is this: there's no avera on the part of the goy, right? That's true. On the other hand, there is an obligation on the part of a Jew not to desecrate the holiness of truma. And the question would be, if he's putting it out in such a way that a goy will consume it, perhaps, I have to check, perhaps that's called a desecration of the holiness of truma. So I wouldn't be allowed to do that, because that's called a chilul of the kedusha of truma. Yeah.
Why do we trust the Zuz Kohen Zichus, but we don't trust other Kohanim or other Levim?
Yeah. So the point is this. You find that we don't trust only when it comes to obligating me. In other words, I have the right. In other words, it's not that we inherently don't trust. It's that when the question is, do I have to give up a Maser Rishon, I'm entitled to say, who knows that you're a Kohen. But if I want to give, I'm allowed to go buster the Chazakah. In other words, so I am permissive. In other words, so since the Truma I have to give up anyway, so I'm permitted to assume that he's a rightful Kohen. Yeah.
On a similar vein, is it a takana that Kohanim should bless the Tehillah with a bracha, even if it's a suffix of their Kohen?
Oh, by Birchas Kohanim. Yeah. So that really proves what I said, and that is the ability to invoke the suffix idea is really a Mammon idea. When Hamotzi Mechaber of Haraya, I have a right to say I don't have to pay you. But Lagabi making a bracha, etc., even Birchas Kohanim, we do permit the assumption of kahuna to be valid. Now, it wouldn't be valid for doing avodah in the Beis Hamikdash, right? All Kohanim have to be on notice that if Be'ezras Hashem, we should be Zaycha to the Binyan Beis Hamikdash B'Karayv, and the Kohanim will show up to be ready to do the avodah in the Beis Hamikdash. So whoever is going to be in charge of this is going to ask you, well, what's your proof that you're a Kohen? And you may want to start preparing now, because you say, well, my father told me. He says, not good enough. You're going to have some real proof. To serve in the Beis Hamikdash, you need a very, very high standard of proof that you don't need for Aliyas and Birkas Kohanim and even Truma, theoretically. You wouldn't need. But for Avodah, you need a very high level. So it could very well be that people who are Kohanim might not be able to make that bar. So Be'ezras Hashem, all of that should become clarified. Okay? So this is just a little bit about Trumas and Masras. Now again, if you remember, we divided produce into three categories. We have vegetables, we have grain, and we have fruit. And for vegetables and grain, the Rosh Hashanah date is Echad B'Tishrei, the day of Rosh Hashanah. And the relevant event that determines the year for vegetables is the harvesting, called Lakita, and for grain it is Havoas Shalish, reaching a third of its final growth. So again, what does that mean? A tomato that was harvested, tomato by tomato, stalk of wheat by stalk of wheat. A tomato that was harvested before Rosh Hashanah belongs to the old year. A tomato that is harvested after Rosh Hashanah belongs to the new year. Grain that reached a third of its growth before Rosh Hashanah belongs to the old year. Grain that reached a third of its growth after Rosh Hashanah belongs to the new year. Okay, vegetables and grain. What is the nafkamina, what year it belongs to? There are two nafkaminas. Nafkamina number one is Maser Sheni versus Maser Ani. Now that's only going to be relevant if you're going from year 2 to 3 and year 5 to 6. Right? Which Maser do you do? If you don't know, you do both, as we said. Right? That's what we do commonly, but if you know, you're supposed to do it the right way. And the other nafkamina is, even if you're going from 1 to 2, or going from 4 to 5, where the Maser Rishon and the Maser Sheni is the same, both years, but you cannot combine Chadash and Yashan, meaning you can't, just like you can't combine min ve'eno mino, you can't combine apples and oranges, you cannot combine produce of years. There has to be a separate hafrasha for the produce of every year, so I have to know what belongs to the old year, what belongs to the new year. Okay, so that's for vegetables and grain. For fruits, the operative botanical event is called chanata. Chanata is budding. That's the appearance of a small bud after the flower falls off the tree. And this is bud by bud by bud by bud. But the relevant Rosh Hashanah is not Echad B'Tishrei. The relevant Rosh Hashanah is Chamisha Asar Bishvat. So again, a fruit that budded before Tu Bishvat belongs to the old year. A fruit that budded after Tu Bishvat, or on Tu Bishvat, or afterwards, belongs to the new year. Okay, so what that means practically is, if I looked at my almond tree and I saw some budding, even though most of the nut will grow later, it's not yet Tu B'Shvat, right? It's the 13th of Shvat. So the fruit is deemed to be a 5783 fruit, not a 5784 fruit. So even though, you understand, even though we are in the year 5784, halachically, it is still 5783 for Ilanis. And therefore, the Truma and Meiser schedule for an Ilan that was Nechenat before Tu B'Shvat is that of the preceding year. Okay, you got that? That's the meaning of Rosh Hashanah le'ilanos. Okay, Chanata and Tu B'Shvat. And as I indicated, this is not relevant for Shemitah. Shemitah is Tishrei to Tishrei no matter what. But with respect to the other years, this is the Truma and Meiser schedule. Yeah.
How did it work in Gan Eden, like the first year? When did it, with the year of the trees, was it already year 1 or year 0?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Gan Eden, well, we'll talk about Orla. That's really a different problem. But that would be, well, first of all, fascinatingly, there are many Makaris and Chazal that Gan Eden was not even in Eretz Yisrael. So, which is pretty strange. Like, why would the ideal world was not in Eretz Yisrael? Is she talking? I mean, what does that mean? If Adam Arishain wouldn't have eaten from the Eitz Hadas, so there wouldn't have been Eretz Yisrael. There would have been, eternal Gan Eden. It's very, very strange and very counterintuitive. But there is such a shita in Chazal, which would indicate that the Trumas and Masos would not be relevant. But I'll come back to it. Okay. So now, yeah.
If Tu B'Shvat hasn't come yet.
If what?
If Tu B'Shvat hasn't come
Yep.
yet, and it's the year after Shemitah.
Yep.
Are those trees?
Yes. So this is the difference. The big exception is that because Shemitah ends the last day of the year, and it does not extend to Tu B'Shvat even for trees, that actually means that year 1 after Shemitah begins Echad B'Tishrei even for trees, meaning a tree that blossomed the year after Shemitah before Tu B'Shvat does not go back to Shemitah. It's year 1. So year 1 is very long. Year 1 for a tree will last from Rosh Hashanah till a year from the Tu B'Shvat. It'll be an 18-month year. You see? Now, the same thing will be true in the opposite direction, year 6. The year 6 for a tree does not begin until Tu B'Shvat of year 6. But it will end Rosh Hashanah of year 7 because that's a Shemitah year. So year 1 for trees will be 18 months, almost 18 months. Year 6 for trees will be 6 months. All the other years will be 12 months or 13 months if it's an Ibrior and the like. Okay, you get that? You get the idea of the long year and the short year. The reason why you have that incongruity is because Shemitah has its own Tishrei Elul calendar, which kind of cuts into the Tu Bishvat calculations for the trees. When it comes to vegetables and grain, there's no problem because everything is working on the same calendar. Shemitah begins in Tishrei, and the year for all of these vegetables and grains is Tishrei, so everything works in synchronization. But when you impose a Tishrei calendar on a Tu B'Shvat schedule, you're going to be cutting a year short and elongating another year to be much longer. So that's exactly the case. Okay, so now let me begin with another branch of halakha. I'll just begin it, and we'll talk about it tomorrow. And that is a din of orla. Now, orla is a very, very important halakha. Once again, if you buy fruit under hashgacha, you don't have to worry about it. But orla means when a tree is planted, you are not allowed to eat the fruit of the tree for 3 years. There are 3 years of orla. In fact, orla is very unique because the truth of the matter is orla even applies in chutz la'aretz. This is very unique. This is one of the very few agricultural laws. Truma, Maser, Shemitah, none of them apply outside of Eretz Yisrael. Orla applies, if you have an apple tree in upstate New York, there could be laws of orla. The only thing is, the Gemara says that if it's a safek orla, you're mekel in chutz la'aretz, but you're machmer in Eretz Yisrael. So there is a difference in safek orla, but vaday orla, you have to be, it's going to be usher in both cases. Now, I want to clarify a misconception that for some reason a lot of people have. Some people think that what orla means is, I can't eat the fruit for 3 years, but after 3 years I can eat the fruit. Not quite true. The fruit that is orla remains forbidden forever. So even if the fruit could be stored or it's made into applesauce, and the applesauce is around 3 years later, 5 years later, if it is orla, it is prohibited forever. It's not that orla is permitted after 3 years. Orla is never permitted. Now, what makes it orla is also chanata, meaning a fruit that budded within the 3 years is orla, even if the majority of its growth was after the 3 years. Okay, once again, you're looking at chanata. So now the critical question becomes, how do you count the 3 years? How do you count it? Are we counting from planting? I got to count 3 years from the planting date? Or is there another principle at work? So I'll just mention one. There are actually a few variations. They're all very interesting. I'll just mention one particular halacha. The Gemara in Rosh Hashanah explains that we vaday go with the principle of miktsas hashana kekula. Part of a year can be called a year. But in order to be part of a year, you have to have at least 30 days of the tree being planted. Meaning, if a tree was planted 30 days before the end of the year, meaning before Elul, that counts as year one. That counts as year one. Shloshim yom bashana. But there's another little chap here. Something is not called halachically planted until it's been in the ground for 14 days, because that's how long it takes, Chazal were Meshayar, for it to take root. So you need rooting, which is called kalita, plus 30 days. 30 days in a root head state, which is a total of 44 days. So any tree that was planted 44 days or more before the end of the year will count as year one. It happens to be that 44 days before Rosh Hashanah is the 15th of Av. So one of the halachic importances of the 15th of Av is, if I plant a tree on or before the 15th of Av, when the year ends, I have completed a year of Orla. Masha Einkein, if I plant the tree less than 44 days before the end of the year, so it either didn't take root if I planted it right at the end of the year, or even if it took root, I didn't have 30 days in a rooted condition, I forfeit that time legamri, and I need 3 full years. So again, let's take an example. If I planted a tree, let's say, on the 15th of Av or earlier, 5754. So 5754 counts as year 1. I then have year 2 from Tishrei to Tishrei, 5755. Year 3 is 5756. So that means, although I just had 2 years and 44 days, that's called 3 years of Orla. Although there'll be an extra complication I'll get to. Masha Ein Kain, if I planted it after the 15th of Av, I don't get the benefit of 5754 at all. I need 3 whole years. I need all of 5755, all of 5756, all of 5757, and it's going to be Orla until 5758. Okay, so you can have a short year. Now, the final point is, though, whenever you benefit from a short year, because you planted 44 days, the Orla restriction does not go off until Tu Bishvat. So, again, let's assume I planted on 15th of Av, 5784. So 5784 counts as year 1. 5785 counts as year 2. 5786 counts as year 3. So the law of Orla should go off after 5786. But the Gemara says it's still going to be Orla until Tu Bishvat. 5786 will be Nimshach until Tu Bishvat of 5787. So the law of Orla will go off on Tu Bishvat of 5787. Now you still have less than 3 years. That's still much less than 3 years. But you have to extend the last year to Tu Bishvat. But the Ran says, when do you have to extend the last year to Tu Bishvat? Only when you didn't have a full 3 years. In other words, you took advantage of the short year, so the last year has to be extended. But says the Ran, when you plant your tree less than 44 days before the end of 5784, so you have 3 full years, 5785, 5786, 5787, then you don't have to wait till Tu Bishvat of 5788 because you have 3 full years, meaning the halacha that requires that you wait to Tu Bishvat for Orla is only when you have cut corners in the beginning, so you have a chumrah at the end. But when you didn't get the advantage of a short year and you had 3 full calendar years, in such a situation, the Orla will be mutter. It's hard to know the svara for that. If Tu Bishvat is Rosh Hashanah Lilanos, then the year shouldn't end until Tu Bishvat. I mean, that's a good kasha. But Lamaisa, this is what the Ran says. Some Rishonim are chaylik, some Rishonim argue with this. But the Ran says, and we paskin la halacha, that when you planted within 44 days before the end of the year, so you don't get the benefit of that year and you need 3 full years, there is no chiyuv to extend the last year to the next Tu Bishvat. Okay? So this is yet another application of Tu Bishvat to the computation of Orla when you took the benefit of the short year by planting 44 days or more before the end of the year. Okay? So we'll stop here.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.